You explain yourself because you still believe compliance earns respect. It doesn't. Every justification you offer is a confession of weakness. The people watching you defend your choices aren't waiting to understand, they're waiting to strike. Chapter 1: The Justification Trap. You've been taught that explaining yourself is a sign of maturity. That clarity prevents conflict. That reasonable people communicate their reasoning. This is a lie. And it's the lie that keeps you defenseless. Every time you justify a decision, a boundary, or a choice, you're not building understanding, you're building a case file. The person listening isn't trying to comprehend your perspective. They're collecting data, mapping your logic, identifying where you're uncertain, finding the pressure points, and the moment they ask, why? The moment you feel compelled to answer, you've already entered a frame you don't control. Explanation is not communication. It's subordination. It's the behavioral signature of someone who believes their authority requires external validation. Kings don't explain. Predators don't justify. Sovereignty doesn't defend itself in the court of someone else's judgment. But you do. And that's why you're still being tested. Here's what actually happens when you explain yourself. First, you reveal that you believe your decision is incomplete without their approval. You wouldn't defend a choice you were certain of. Second, you hand them the blueprint of your reasoning, which means they now know exactly how to dismantle it. Third, you train them. You teach them that if they apply pressure, you'll comply. You'll open the door. You'll give them access. This is why the same people keep questioning you. Why your boundaries get negotiated. Why your no becomes a discussion. It's not because they don't understand. It's because you keep explaining, and every explanation is an invitation to challenge you again. The justification trap is elegant. It operates under the cover of civility. You think you're being respectful, transparent, accountable. But what you're actually doing is outsourcing your certainty. You're asking permission retroactively. You're saying, I made this decision, but I need you to agree with it for it to be valid. And they hear that. They feel it. And they know, consciously or not, that you're not operating from a position of power. This pattern didn't start with you. It was installed early. Every time a parent demanded, why did you do that? When they'd already decided you were wrong. Every teacher who made you justify your answer even when it was correct. Every relationship where your boundaries were treated as opening arguments instead of final verdicts. You were conditioned to believe that explanation equals respect. That silence equals arrogance. That withholding your reasoning is cruelty. But let's test that belief. Think of the last person who had complete control over you, boss, parent, institution. Did they explain themselves? Or did they simply state what would happen and you complied? Think of the last time someone denied you something with no justification. Did their refusal become less real because they didn't walk you through their thought process? No, it stood. Because power doesn't require footnotes. You've been operating under a false economy. You think giving people explanations buys you peace, cooperation, goodwill. What it actually buys you is more interrogation. Because every time you justify yourself, you signal that your decisions are negotiable. That if someone applies enough pressure, asks enough questions, frames their confusion as hurt, you'll fold. You'll open the vault. You'll explain until they're satisfied, which they never will be because satisfaction isn't the goal. Control is. The trap isn't just external. It's internal. You've convinced yourself that withholding explanation makes you cold, unreasonable, difficult. So you over-explain preemptively. You build cases for decisions no one even challenged. You justify boundaries before anyone tests them. You're defending yourself against an imaginary trial, and in doing so you're prosecuting yourself. Here's the shift. Your decisions are not up for review. Your boundaries are not legislation requiring a vote. Your life is not a democracy where everyone gets a say if they ask loudly enough. The moment you start explaining, you've accepted the premise that someone else has jurisdiction over your choices. They don't. This chapter is the lens correction. Everything you've been taught about transparency, communication, and mutual understanding in the context of your own sovereignty, discard it. It was designed for a world where everyone operates in good faith. You don't live in that world. You live in a world where people test, extract, and position. And every explanation you give is a concession in a game you didn't realize you were playing. You don't owe anyone a roadmap of your reasoning. Not your thoughts. Not your logic. Not your justifications. The belief that you do is the cage. And you've been locking yourself inside it every time you answer the question why. Chapter 2. Why your brain betrays you. Your need to explain isn't a personality flaw. It's a biological exploit. Your brain was built for tribes of 150 people where being misunderstood could mean exile, starvation, death. That circuitry is still running. And in the modern world, it's being weaponized against you. Every time someone questions your decision, your amygdala registers a threat. Not a physical one, a social one. Your nervous system doesn't distinguish. The fear of being misunderstood, judged, or rejected triggers the same survival response as being stalked by a predator. Your body floods with cortisol. Your heart rate spikes. And your brain does what it was designed to do: resolve the threat. How? By explaining. By making the other person understand. By repairing the social bond before it fractures. This is the hijack. Your biology is being used as a remote control. Someone asks, "Why did you do that?" And your system interprets it as you're in danger of losing status, safety, belonging. So you comply. You open your mouth. You justify. You defend. Not because it's strategic, because your brain is trying to save you from a threat that no longer exists. Here's the problem: the people questioning you know this. Maybe not consciously, but instinctively. They've learned that if they frame their demand as confusion, disappointment, or concern, you'll short-circuit. You'll override your own judgment and start performing. Explaining. Reassuring. Proving. And while you're doing that, you're no longer operating as a sovereign agent. You're operating as someone who needs approval to feel safe. This response was adaptive 10,000 years ago. It kept you alive. But the environment has changed. You're no longer in a tribe where cooperation equals survival. You're in a world where the majority of people you interact with have no material impact on your safety, your resources, or your future. Yet your brain still treats a coworker's skepticism, a family member's guilt trip, or a stranger's disapproval as an existential crisis. It's not. But your nervous system doesn't know that. The second layer of this betrayal is even more insidious. You've been socially conditioned to believe that this response is virtuous. That explaining yourself is good communication. That justifying your choices is emotional intelligence. That refusing to do so is avoidant or defensive. This is gaslighting at a cultural level. It reframes your compliance as maturity and your sovereignty as pathology. Let's be precise about what happened. From childhood, you were punished for withholding explanation. Teachers demanded you show your work. Parents demanded you justify your decisions even when they'd already decided you were wrong. Authority figures taught you that your reasoning was always subject to audit. That you didn't own your choices, you rented them contingent on others' approval. And if you resisted, you were labeled difficult, disrespectful, problematic. This conditioning didn't stop at childhood. Every workplace, every relationship, every social structure reinforced it. Help me understand. Walk me through your thought process. I just need you to explain. These phrases sound reasonable, collaborative, but they're Trojan horses. They're designed to trigger your compliance reflex. And once you start explaining, the frame shifts. You're no longer the decision maker. You're the defendant. The third element: your brain craves resolution. Ambiguity is uncomfortable. When someone expresses confusion or disagreement, your system interprets that as an open loop. A problem that needs solving. So you solve it the only way you know how, by explaining until they understand, agree, or at least stop questioning. But here's what you're missing. Their confusion is often performative. Their questions aren't requests for information. They're tests. And every time you answer, you fail. This is why the same people keep questioning you. Your nervous system thinks it's resolving conflict. But what you're actually doing is training them. You're teaching them that if they express confusion, you'll comply. If they frame their interrogation as care, you'll open up. If they push, you'll justify. You think you're building trust. You're building dependency. And dependency is control. Your biology wasn't designed for this game. It was designed for environments where everyone in your circle had shared survival incentives. Where cooperation was mutual. Where trust was earned over years, not performed on demand. But you're no longer in that environment. You're in a world where strangers, acquaintances, and even people close to you will exploit your wiring if it serves them. And they don't need to be malicious to do it. They just need to ask the right question and watch you short-circuit. The most dangerous part of this betrayal is that it feels righteous. When you explain yourself, you feel like you're being fair, honest, open. Your brain rewards you with a hit of oxytocin, the bonding chemical. You've connected. You've been vulnerable. But vulnerability without discernment isn't connection. It's exposure. And exposure without power is a liability. Here's the recalibration. Your need to be understood is not a moral imperative. It's a biological reflex. And reflexes can be retrained. The discomfort you feel when you withhold explanation isn't evidence that you're doing something wrong, it's evidence that you're breaking a pattern your nervous system has relied on for survival. That discomfort is the cost of sovereignty. And if you're not willing to pay it, you'll keep explaining yourself into subordination. You don't need to make people comfortable with your decisions. You don't need to resolve their confusion. You don't need to close the loop their questions opened. That loop is bait. And every time you take it, you're not being mature, you're being managed. Your brain is a tool. But right now, someone else is holding it. This chapter is the beginning of taking it back. Chapter 3. The 3 archetypes who drain you. Not everyone who asks why is operating from the same playbook. But the result is identical. You explain and they gain ground. There are 3 archetypes who specialize in extracting justification from you. Learn to identify them. Because once you see the pattern, you'll stop mistaking interrogation for conversation. The interrogator doesn't ask questions to understand. They ask questions to destabilize. Their goal isn't clarity, it's doubt. They operate by framing your decisions as incomplete, impulsive, or suspicious. Why would you do that? What made you think that was a good idea? Are you sure about this? Each question is a small incision. Individually, they seem harmless. Cumulatively, they're surgery without anesthesia. The interrogator knows that if they can get you to defend your choice, they've already shifted the power dynamic. You're no longer the authority on your own life. You're a witness being cross-examined. And the more you explain, the more material they have to work with. They'll find the inconsistency, the gap in your logic, the moment of uncertainty. And they'll exploit it. Not because they care about the truth, because they care about control. Here's how you know you're dealing with an interrogator. Their questions never end in satisfaction. You explain. They ask a follow-up. You clarify. They reframe. You provide evidence. They question the evidence. The goal isn't resolution. It's exhaustion. They're training you to second-guess yourself. To seek their approval before acting. To operate as if your decisions require their sign-off. And if you comply long enough, they become the authority in your life by default. The interrogator thrives in workplaces, relationships, and families. They disguise their control as due diligence, or just trying to understand. But watch what happens when you stop explaining. They escalate. They accuse you of being defensive, secretive, unreasonable. Because your refusal to justify yourself exposes the game. And they need you back in the defendant's chair. The victim operates differently. They don't question your decision, they personalize it. I just feel like you don't trust me. It hurts that you won't explain. I don't understand why you're shutting me out. They weaponize emotion. They frame your boundary as an attack. Your silence as cruelty. Your sovereignty as abandonment. The victim's power comes from guilt. They position your refusal to explain as evidence that you don't care. That you're cold. That you're damaging the relationship. And if you've been conditioned to prioritize harmony over boundaries, which most of you have, you'll fold. You'll explain. You'll reassure. You'll perform emotional labor to prove you're not the villain they're painting you as. But here's the trap. The victim isn't asking you to explain because they need information. They're asking because they need control. They've learned that if they frame your autonomy as emotional harm, you'll sacrifice it to repair the bond. And once you do, they've established a precedent. Your decisions are subject to their feelings. Your boundaries are negotiable if they cry hard enough. Your life becomes a democracy where their emotions get a veto. The victim shows up in romantic relationships, friendships, and family systems. They're the person who interprets your no as rejection, who treats your need for space as punishment, who makes your choices about them. And the more you explain to prove you still care, the more you validate their framework. You're not resolving their insecurity, you're funding it. Here's the tell. The victim never accepts your explanation. You clarify. They feel worse. You reassure. They find a new way you've hurt them. Because the explanation was never the goal. The performance was. They need you in the role of someone who has to prove their loyalty, their care, their commitment. And as long as you're explaining, you're auditioning. Which means they're casting director. Which means you've already lost. The curator is the most dangerous because they don't seem dangerous at all. They ask questions casually. They're just curious. They want to understand your perspective. They frame their extraction as intellectual interest. And because they're not aggressive like the interrogator or emotional like the victim, you let your guard down. You explain. You share your reasoning. You open the vault. The curator doesn't challenge you in the moment. They collect. Every explanation you give is filed. Every justification is cataloged. Every moment of uncertainty is recorded. And then later, days, weeks, months, they use it. They'll reference something you said when you were unguarded. They'll quote your reasoning back to you when it's inconvenient. They'll use your own words to box you in, undermine you, or prove you're inconsistent. The curator operates in professional settings, competitive friendships, and any environment where information is currency. They're the colleague who asks about your strategy, just to learn. The acquaintance who wants to pick your brain. The person who frames their questions as collaboration but never reciprocates. They're building a file. And you're the one handing them the documents. Here's how you spot them. They ask questions but never make decisions. They're always gathering information but never applying it. They remember everything you've said with unsettling precision. And when you stop explaining, they don't get emotional or aggressive, they just disappear. Because you were never a person to them. You were a source. The common thread across all three archetypes. They've learned that you'll comply if they frame their demand correctly. The interrogator frames it as due diligence. The victim frames it as emotional need. The curator frames it as mutual respect. But the outcome is identical. You explain. They extract. You lose ground. None of these archetypes are inherently evil. Most of them don't even realize what they're doing. They're operating from their own conditioning, their own survival strategies, their own wiring. But intent doesn't matter. Impact does. And the impact is that every time you justify yourself to them, you're reinforcing a dynamic where your sovereignty is contingent on their approval. You've been trained to see these people as reasonable, concerned, invested in you. And maybe some of them are. But reasonable people don't require you to defend your choices. Concerned people don't interrogate your boundaries. Invested people don't collect your vulnerabilities like evidence. The shift is simple: stop feeding them. The interrogator gets silence. The victim gets a boundary without explanation. The curator gets nothing. And when they escalate, and they will, you'll know you were right about them. Chapter 4. The History of Silence as Dominance. Power has never explained itself. Not in nature. Not in history. Not in the structures that shape your life right now. The belief that authority requires justification is a modern fiction. And it's a fiction designed to make you manageable. Look at the natural world first. Apex predators don't justify their position. A lion doesn't explain why it gets to eat first. A wolf doesn't defend its place in the hierarchy with reasoning. Dominance in nature is declared through action, presence, and the willingness to enforce boundaries without negotiation. The alpha doesn't prove itself through discourse. It proves itself through certainty. And the moment it starts justifying its position, it's no longer alpha. It's been challenged. And in nature, a successful challenge means the hierarchy has already shifted. You are not exempt from these patterns. Your biology recognizes them even when your conditioning tells you to ignore them. Every time you justify yourself, every person watching registers it the same way a pack registers an alpha that defends instead of declares. Weakness, uncertainty, an opening. Now look at human history. Every empire, every ruling class, every structure of concentrated power operated on the principle of unexplained authority. Roman senators didn't justify their edicts to the plebeians. Monarchs didn't explain their decrees to peasants. The Catholic Church didn't defend its doctrine in open debate. It declared, and compliance was assumed. This wasn't cruelty. This was function. Authority that requires constant justification isn't authority. It's a proposal under review. You've been taught to see this as tyranny, as oppression, as the dark age of human governance. But strip away the moral framing and look at the mechanism. Those systems endured for centuries, some for millennia, not because they were just, but because they understood a fundamental truth. Explanation dilutes power. The moment you justify, you've entered into a contract where the other party gets to judge the sufficiency of your reasoning. And if they can judge it, they can reject it. Which means they've become the authority. This is why revolutions don't begin with arguments. They begin when the ruling power starts explaining itself. When kings justify their divine right, the divine right is already in question. When institutions defend their legitimacy is already contested. Explanation is the sound of power leaking. The modern world inverted this. You've been sold the idea that transparency equals strength. That leaders who explain their decisions are more trustworthy. That institutions accountable to public opinion are more legitimate. This is a beautiful lie. What actually happened is that power learned to disguise itself. The people who truly control systems don't explain. They hire spokespeople to explain. They create committees to provide justification. They build entire bureaucracies whose function is to generate the appearance of accountability. But the actual decisions? Those happen in rooms you'll never enter by people who will never justify themselves to you. You're told to explain yourself while watching the powerful refuse to do the same. Your boss doesn't explain why you didn't get promoted. HR sends an email with corporate language. The government doesn't explain why policy shifted. A press secretary reads a statement. The platform doesn't explain why your account was suspended. An algorithm makes the decision and you get a boilerplate response. You live in a world where you're required to justify everything while the systems that govern you justify nothing. And yet you comply. You explain yourself to people who have no authority over you, who control none of your resources, who can't impact your survival. You explain to coworkers, acquaintances, family members, strangers online. You've democratized your sovereignty. You've made your life a public forum where anyone can demand justification and you'll provide it, because you've internalized the belief that withholding explanation is authoritarian. But let's test that belief with precision. Think of the last time someone with real power over you, an employer, an institution, a government body, denied you something. Did they explain? Or did they simply state the outcome and move on? And when they didn't explain, did their decision become less enforceable? No, it stood. Because real power doesn't require your understanding to function. Now think of the last time you explained yourself to someone who had zero material power over you. Did that explanation strengthen your position? Or did it open a negotiation you didn't realize you were entering? You already know the answer. The pattern repeats across every domain where power operates. Master negotiators don't explain their offers. They state them and wait. Elite salespeople don't justify the price. They anchor it and let you rationalize. Strategic leaders don't defend their vision. They declare it and let commitment filter the room. In every high-stakes environment, the people who win are the people who speak last, explain least, and refuse to justify what they've already decided. Even in your personal relationships, look at who holds the frame. It's not the person who explains their boundaries, it's the person who enforces them without discussion. It's not the person who justifies their decisions, it's the person whose decisions stand regardless of understanding. You've been conditioned to see this as coldness. It's not. It's sovereignty. And sovereignty has never required a defense. The philosophers understood this. Machiavelli wrote that it's better to be feared than loved because love is fickle and fear is constant. But he didn't say feared and explained. Nietzsche wrote about the will to power, the drive that separates those who create values from those who inherit them. He didn't write about the will to consensus. Sun Tzu wrote that all warfare is based on deception, that the greatest victory is the battle not fought. He didn't write about transparency. These weren't cruel men. They were men who observed reality without the distortion of how things should be. And reality has always operated the same way. Power concentrates in the hands of those who can act without needing permission, approval, or understanding from the people their actions affect. You've been taught the opposite. You've been taught that explaining yourself is respect. That justification is integrity. That silence is arrogance. This teaching benefits one group, the people who want access to you. Your reasoning. Your decision-making process. Your vulnerabilities. Because once they have that, they can manage you. They can predict you. They can control you. Silence isn't the absence of communication. It's the refusal to negotiate your authority. And throughout all of human history, stripped of the modern mythology of democratic decision-making, the people who refused to negotiate were the people who ruled. You don't have to like this. But you do have to decide, do you want to be understood or do you want to be sovereign? Because you've been trying to have both and it's why you're still being tested. Chapter 5. The Protocol, Operational Silence. Theory is useless without execution. You now understand why you explain yourself and who benefits when you do. This chapter is the manual. These are the precise behaviors that replace justification with sovereignty. No philosophy. No metaphor. Just operational code. The redirect. When someone asks why, your reflex is to answer. Don't. Redirect the frame back to outcome, not reasoning. Example, they ask, why did you decide that? You respond, it's handled. Or, it's done. Or, that's the direction. Notice what you didn't do, you didn't say because. The word because is a portal. It opens the negotiation. The redirect closes it. You're not refusing to communicate. You're refusing to defend. The redirect works because it doesn't engage with the premise of their question. Their question assumes you owe them your reasoning. The redirect rejects that assumption without stating the rejection. You're not arguing about whether you should explain. You're simply not explaining. And the absence of argument is more powerful than winning one. Practice this until it's automatic. Why would you do that? becomes, it's what I'm doing. Can you walk me through your thought process? Becomes, the decision's made. I just want to understand becomes, there's nothing to understand, this is what's happening. Short. Declarative. No justification. No apology. No invitation to continue the interrogation. The boundary without explanation. This is the most difficult for you because you've been conditioned to believe that boundaries without reasons are cruel. They're not. They're enforceable. When you set a boundary and then explain why, you've handed someone the blueprint for dismantling it. They'll either argue with your reasoning or find an exception that fits within your logic. The boundary collapses. Instead, I'm not available for that. Not, I'm not available because I'm busy. Just the boundary. When they push and they will, you repeat it. I'm not available for that. Same words. Same tone. No elaboration. This technique is called the broken record, and it's effective because it denies them new material to work with. They're looking for a crack in your reasoning. You're not giving them reasoning. There's nothing to crack. The pattern, state the boundary once. If they ask why, restate the boundary. If they push, restate again. If they escalate emotionally, restate without emotion. You're not being cold. You're being immovable. And immovable is what boundaries actually are when they're not performances. Watch what happens. Most people will test 2, maybe 3 times. When they realize you're not negotiating, they'll either accept it or remove themselves. Either outcome serves you. The ones who stay have learned you're not manageable. The ones who leave have revealed they were only there because you were. The strategic no. You've been taught that no requires softening. I'd love to, but. Or, I really wish I could, but. This is waste. Every word after no is you apologizing for having a boundary. It signals that your no isn't firm, it's conditional. And conditional means negotiable. The strategic no is complete. No. Full sentence. No qualifiers. No justifications. No cushioning. If you must expand, and you rarely must, the maximum is, no, that doesn't work for me. Even that is more than necessary. But if the silence after no feels unbearable, that phrasing closes the loop without opening negotiation. Here's the test. If you can't say no without explaining why, you don't actually believe you have the right to say no. You believe you need permission. And you're trying to get that permission by providing reasoning they'll accept. But their acceptance is irrelevant. Your no doesn't require their approval to function. The moment you understand this, the strategic no becomes effortless. The art of non-response. Not every question deserves an answer. Not every accusation deserves a defense. Not every misunderstanding deserves correction. You've been operating as if engagement is mandatory. It's not. Silence is a complete response. When someone baits you with, so you're just not going to explain yourself? The answer is, nothing. No response. They're trying to make your silence a thing you have to defend. Don't. Let it stand. Your silence isn't a gap they get to fill. It's a wall. And walls don't argue with the people testing them. The art of non-response is especially critical in written communication. Emails, texts, messages, these create a false sense of obligation. You see the question. Your brain registers it as a task. You feel compelled to close the loop. Don't. If a question doesn't serve you to answer, archive it. If a demand doesn't warrant acknowledgement, let it expire. The person on the other end will do one of 2 things. Escalate or move on. If they escalate, they've shown you who they are. If they move on, the urgent question wasn't urgent. This doesn't mean you ignore everyone. It means you stop treating every inquiry as if it has authority over you. You choose what you respond to based on whether the response serves your objectives, not based on whether someone asked. Linguistic armor, the minimal acknowledgement. Sometimes silence or redirect isn't socially viable. You're in a meeting, a family dinner, a situation where non-engagement would create more friction than it's worth. In these cases, use minimal acknowledgement. Noted. I hear you. Understood. These phrases acknowledge that they spoke without agreeing, disagreeing, or explaining. Minimal acknowledgement is a tactical retreat that doesn't concede ground. It satisfies the social requirement of response without giving them leverage. They said something. You confirmed you received it. The transaction is complete. If they push for more, you've already given them the ceiling. I already addressed that, or I've said what I'm going to say. Then stop. The key is to deliver these without defensiveness. Defensiveness signals that you feel accused, which means you've accepted their frame. Your tone should be neutral. Almost bored. You're not fighting them. You're not engaging with them. You're closing the interaction. Reframing questions as statements. When someone asks, "Why did you do that?" they're framing the interaction as an interrogation. You're the subject. They're the investigator. Flip it. Respond with a statement that reframes the dynamic. "That's what I decided," or "That's the move." You've shifted from defendant to authority. The question no longer hangs in the air waiting for your justification. It's been answered, not with reasoning but with finality. This works because it doesn't reject their question outright, which would invite conflict. It answers it in a way that provides no material for follow-up. They can't argue with, "That's what I decided," the way they could argue with, "I decided that because X, Y, Z." There's nothing to dismantle. The statement is self-contained. The refusal to justify emotion. People will demand you explain not just your actions but your feelings. Why are you upset? Why are you being distant? Why won't you talk to me? These are traps. If you explain your emotions, you're giving them a manual for managing you. They'll either invalidate your feelings by arguing with your reasoning, or they'll use the information to push the same buttons later. Instead, "I'm handling it," or "I'm processing," or "I'll address it when I'm ready." You're not denying the emotion. You're refusing to make it their business. Your internal state is not a collaborative project. It's sovereign territory. They don't get access just because they asked. If they accuse you of shutting them out, that's confirmation you're doing it correctly. People who respect boundaries don't frame them as rejection. People who want control do. The final rule: no preemptive justification. This is the mistake that undoes most of you. You explain yourself before anyone even asks. You justify decisions no one challenged. You defend boundaries no one tested. You're trying to prevent conflict by front-loading your reasoning. What you're actually doing is training people to expect it. Stop explaining things no one questioned. If you make a decision and no one asks, let it stand. If you set a boundary and no one pushes, don't elaborate. Preemptive justification signals insecurity. It tells people your choices are fragile, that you don't trust them to hold without external validation. Sovereignty doesn't announce itself. It just is. And the more you practice withholding justification, the less you'll feel the compulsion to provide it. The discomfort you feel now is withdrawal. You're breaking an addiction to approval. The discomfort is the process. It's not evidence you're doing something wrong. It's evidence you're doing something different. This is the protocol. Each technique is surgical, repeatable, scalable across every domain of your life. You don't need to master all of them immediately. Pick one. Deploy it for a week. Watch what happens. Then add the next. The goal isn't to become robotic. It's to become selective. To stop hemorrhaging your reasoning to people who haven't earned access to it. To reclaim the energy you've been spending on justifying your existence. You'll know it's working when people stop asking. When your no stands without negotiation. When your decisions are accepted as fact rather than opening arguments. When the people who used to test you either fall in line or fall away. And when they accuse you of changing, of becoming cold, of shutting them out. That's not failure. That's confirmation. You're no longer manageable. And they're upset about it.